I never thought my daughter would be capable of something like this. Not Rebecca. Not the girl I had raised single-handedly after her mother walked out when she was barely 5 years old. The same daughter who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, clutching her stuffed elephant and whispering that she felt safe with Daddy. Not the young woman whose college graduation I attended despite being in the middle of chemotherapy, my bald head covered with a baseball cap as tears of pride streamed down my face. But as I sat in the passenger seat of the taxi, staring at the sold sign planted firmly in the front yard of what had been my home for 32 years, I had to face the brutal truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The house where Rebecca had taken her first steps, where we had celebrated every birthday and Christmas, where I had nursed her through chickenpox and helped her with algebra homework until midnight, was gone. Sold while I lay unconscious in intensive care, fighting for my life after a massive stroke that the doctors said should have killed me. "Are you sure this is the right address, sir?" I asked the taxi driver, my voice barely above a whisper. The stroke had affected my speech, making even simple words feel clumsy and foreign in my mouth. "This is 412 Maple Street, just like you asked," he replied, glancing at me with concern in the rearview mirror. "You okay back there?" I wasn't okay. Nothing about this was okay. 3 weeks ago, I had been Robert Chen, a 67-year-old, retired high school chemistry teacher who had spent his entire adult life in this modest 2-story colonial. I had bought it fresh out of college with my wife, Linda, back when we thought we had forever to fill its rooms with children and laughter. After Linda left, claiming she needed to find herself somewhere that didn't include the responsibilities of motherhood, this house had become my sanctuary, my fortress, the place where I proved that a man could raise a daughter just as well as any woman. Now, as I struggled to process what I was seeing, I realized that the life I had built, the security I had worked 3 jobs to maintain, had been stripped away while I fought to remember how to breathe on my own. The front door opened, and Rebecca emerged, her designer heels clicking against the concrete steps. At 28, she was beautiful in the way that success and money could make someone beautiful, her auburn hair styled perfectly, her navy business suit tailored to perfection. Behind her came a man I didn't recognize, tall and confident, carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. "Dad," Rebecca said, her voice carrying that particular tone she had developed over the years, the one that suggested I was being unreasonable before I had even spoken. "You're supposed to be at Sunrise Manor. I specifically told them you'd be arriving this afternoon." Sunrise Manor. The memory came flooding back, along with a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with my medication. During one of my more lucid moments in the hospital, Rebecca had shown me brochures for what she called senior living communities. I had been too weak to argue properly, my words still slurred from the stroke, but I remembered shaking my head, trying to make her understand that I wanted to come home. "Rebecca," I managed, each syllable requiring tremendous effort. "What have you done?" She exchanged a glance with the man beside her, who I now realized must be her husband. David something. I had never met him, though they had been married for 6 months. Rebecca had sent me a photo from their destination wedding in Tuscany, explaining that they had wanted something intimate, and that my recent health scares would have made travel difficult for me anyway. "Dad, we talked about this," she said, walking toward the taxi with that patient expression people use when they're explaining something to a child. "You don't need all this space anymore. It's not practical. The house was just sitting here, empty, accumulating expenses." "It's my house," I said, the words coming out louder than I intended. "I've lived here for 32 years. This is my home." "Was your home," David interjected, extending his hand toward me in a gesture that was probably meant to appear friendly, but felt condescending. "David Morrison, Rebecca's husband." I've heard so much about you." I stared at his outstretched hand, but didn't take it. Something about his smile, too wide and too practiced, reminded me of the pharmaceutical sales representatives who used to visit my classroom, promising that their latest educational materials would revolutionize science. Education while they calculated their commission percentages. "The important thing," Rebecca continued, opening the taxi door wider as if expecting me to get out and join them, "is that we were able to get an excellent price. Well above market value, actually. David has connections in real estate investment." Investment. The word hit me like a physical blow. My home. The place where I had bandaged Rebecca's scraped knees and taught her how to ride a bicycle, where we had held memorial services for 3 different goldfish, and where she had practiced her valedictorian speech in front of the bathroom. Mirror had been reduced to an investment opportunity. "I didn't agree to sell," I said, my speech becoming clearer as anger began to override the lingering effects of the stroke. "I never signed anything." Rebecca sighed, the sound carrying years of what I now recognized as barely concealed impatience. "Dad, you have power of attorney papers on file. We discussed this before your stroke, remember? When you were worried about what would happen if something happened to you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The papers. I did remember signing them, but it had been years ago, when Rebecca was still in college, and I was paranoid about leaving her without resources if something happened to me. I had been thinking about emergency medical decisions, not giving her carte blanche to dismantle my entire life. "Those were for emergencies," I said, surprised by how steady my voice had become. "Medical decisions if I couldn't make them myself." "This is a medical decision," David said smoothly. "The doctors were very clear that you shouldn't be living alone anymore. The stairs in your house, the isolation, the maintenance requirements, it's all potentially dangerous for someone in your condition." My condition. As if the stroke had transformed me from a functioning adult into an invalid who couldn't be trusted to make decisions about his own life. I thought about Dr. Martinez, my neurologist, who had been cautiously optimistic about my recovery. My speech was improving daily, my motor functions were nearly back to normal, and my cognitive abilities had been largely unaffected. I wasn't dying. I wasn't incompetent. I was healing. "Where are my things?" I asked, looking past them toward the house that now belonged to strangers. "Everything's been taken care of," Rebecca assured me. "The important items are in storage, and the rest was donated. You know how much stuff you had accumulated over the years. Most of it was just clutter anyway. Clutter, my books, my photo albums, the pottery wheel I had bought after retirement, the garden tools I had used to maintain the yard that had been my pride and joy, the rocking chair where I had read Rebecca bedtime stories, the desk where I had graded thousands of chemistry tests, the kitchen table where we had shared breakfast every morning for 18 years, all of it reduced to clutter." "Your mother's things?" I asked, thinking of the small collection of Linda's belongings I had kept, not out of sentiment for her, but because I thought Rebecca might want them someday. "Dad, Mom left 23 years ago," Rebecca said with exasperation. "Keeping her stuff was just another example of you being unable to let go of things that no longer serve a purpose." The casual cruelty of the statement took my breath away. I had kept Linda's jewelry, her books, a few photographs, thinking that someday Rebecca might want to understand the mother who had abandoned her. But apparently, holding on to connections to the past was just another character flaw in Rebecca's assessment of my life. "I want to see the storage unit," I said. "Dad, you're being dramatic. Sunrise Manor is lovely. They have activities, a dining room, medical staff on site 24 hours a day. You'll make friends. You'll be safe." Safe. The word that had become a prison. I understood now that this wasn't about my recovery or my well-being. This was about Rebecca's convenience, about eliminating the complications that having an aging father might create in her new life with David. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and tried to find traces of the little girl who used to help me bake cookies for her school fundraisers, who would sit on my lap while I explained the periodic table, making up stories about the personalities of different elements. That child had been curious and kind, delighted by small adventures, and unimpressed by material possessions. The woman standing before me now carried herself with the confidence that money and status could provide. But there was something hollow in her eyes, something that reminded me of Linda during those final months before she left. A restlessness, a dissatisfaction, as if she were constantly calculating whether her current circumstances were sufficient or if she needed to trade up to something better. "How much did you get for the house?" I asked. David and Rebecca exchanged another look. "Dad, that's not really—" Rebecca began. "How much?" $450,000, David answered when Rebecca hesitated. "It was a cash offer, which is why we had to move quickly. These opportunities don't wait." $450,000. I had bought the house for $68,000 in 1991. Even accounting for improvements and market appreciation, this was far more than I had ever imagined it was worth. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something that might have been relief. At least I wouldn't be destitute. "Where is the money?" I asked. "Safe," Rebecca said quickly. "In an investment account that David set up. Much better returns than if you had just left it sitting in your savings account." An investment account that David set up. David, who I had met 3 minutes ago. David, who had somehow convinced my daughter that selling her father's home while he was unconscious was not only acceptable, but prudent. "I want to see the paperwork," I said. "Dad, you're exhausting yourself. Why don't we get you settled at Sunrise Manor, and then we can go over all the financial details once you're feeling better?" The taxi driver, who had been listening to this exchange with growing discomfort, cleared his throat. "Excuse me, sir, but do you want me to wait? The meter's still running." I looked at the driver, then at my daughter, then at the house that was no longer mine. A profound exhaustion settled over me, not the physical fatigue that had plagued me since the stroke, but something deeper. The exhaustion of realizing that the person you had devoted your life to protecting and nurturing viewed you primarily as an obstacle to be managed. "Take me to Sunrise Manor," I said quietly. Rebecca's relief was visible. "You'll see, Dad. It's going to be so much better for you. No more worrying about maintenance or yard work or being alone all the time." As the taxi pulled away from Maple Street, I watched my former home disappear in the rear window, 32 years of memories reduced to a real estate transaction. I thought about all the times I had worried about Rebecca's future, all the sacrifices I had made to ensure she had every opportunity, all the nights I had stayed up helping her with homework or talking her through teenage heartbreaks. I had raised her to be strong and independent, to think for herself and stand up for what she believed in. I had succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. The problem was that what she believed in now was her own convenience, and what she stood up for was her right to make decisions about other people's lives without their consent. Sunrise Manor turned out to be exactly what I had expected, a sterile facility designed to warehouse the elderly while their families got on with their real lives. The lobby was decorated in soft pastels and filled with artificial plants, trying to create an atmosphere of homey comfort that fooled no one. The residents I saw were either staring blankly at a television or sleeping in wheelchairs, and the staff moved with the efficient indifference of people who had seen too many new admissions to invest emotionally in any of them. "Mr. Chen!" The director, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, approached with the kind of aggressive cheerfulness that made my teeth ache. "We've been expecting you. Your daughter has told us so much about you." I wondered what exactly Rebecca had told them. That I was a helpless invalid who needed constant supervision? That I was too addled by my stroke to make rational decisions? that I was lucky to have such a devoted daughter who was willing to handle all the complicated details of my life. "She's handled all the paperwork," Mrs. Patterson continued, leading me down a corridor lined with identical doors. "Your room is lovely, and you'll be just in time for dinner. We're having meatloaf tonight, everyone's favorite." My room turned out to be a 12 by 15 space with a single bed, a dresser, a small table, and a chair. The window looked out onto a parking lot. On the dresser sat a single framed photograph of Rebecca at her college graduation, smiling broadly in her cap and gown. It was the only personal item in the room. "Where are the rest of my things?" I asked Mrs. Patterson. "Oh, I'm sure your daughter will bring whatever you need," she said brightly. "We find that residents adjust better when they're not overwhelmed with too many possessions at first." Overwhelmed. Another word that had apparently been used to describe my current mental state. I was beginning to understand that everyone, Rebecca, David, the medical staff, the facility director, had decided that the stroke had rendered me incapable of managing the complexities of adult life. They were all working together to protect me from the overwhelming burden of making my own decisions. After Mrs. Patterson left, I sat on the narrow bed and stared out at the parking lot. For the first time since waking up in the hospital, I had a moment of complete clarity about my situation. My daughter had sold my home, liquidated my possessions, and deposited me in an institution, all while convincing herself and everyone else that she was acting in my best interests. The worst part was that she probably genuinely believed it. Rebecca had always been a problem solver, someone who saw obstacles as challenges to be overcome through decisive action. In her mind, having an aging father with health issues was simply another problem that required an efficient solution. The fact that the solution involved dismantling my autonomy and independence was just an unfortunate but necessary side effect. I thought about calling someone but realized that I didn't know who. My colleagues from the high school had scattered after retirement, pursuing their own families and interests. My neighbors on Maple Street had been friendly but not close. Linda's family had written me off years ago when she left. Rebecca had been my primary relationship for so long that I had let other connections atrophy. That night, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of institutional life around me, I made a decision. I was 67 years old, not 97. My stroke had been serious but not devastating. My mind was clear, my speech was improving, and my body was growing stronger every day. I was not ready to be warehoused like damaged inventory. More importantly, I was not ready to let Rebecca's version of my story become the final chapter. If she wanted to believe that she had rescued me from an unmanageable situation, that was her choice. But I was going to rescue myself from the life she had chosen for me. I didn't know yet how I was going to do it, but as I lay there in the darkness, surrounded by the gentle snoring and occasional confused calls of my fellow residents, I felt something I hadn't experienced since waking up in the hospital: determination. Rebecca thought she had solved the problem of what to do with her inconvenient father. What she had actually done was create a much bigger problem: a man with nothing left to lose and a powerful motivation to reclaim his life. The first week at Sunrise Manor passed in a haze of scheduled meals, mandatory activities, and well-meaning staff members who spoke to me as if I were a confused child. Every morning at 7 sharp, an aide named Carmen would knock on my door and announce that it was time for breakfast, as if I had forgotten how to tell time along with everything else they assumed I had lost to the stroke. "Good morning, Mr. Chen," she would chirp, her voice carrying that particular brand of forced enthusiasm that healthcare workers use when they're trying to motivate people they secretly pity. "Ready for another beautiful day?" I wanted to tell her that there was nothing beautiful about being warehoused against your will, but I had learned quickly that expressing dissatisfaction with my circumstances only resulted in concerned conversations about adjustment difficulties and veiled threats about increasing my medication to help with agitation. Instead, I began to watch and listen. I observed the patterns of the facility, the shift changes, the routines that governed every aspect of life here. I noticed which staff members actually cared about the residents and which ones were simply collecting paychecks. I learned that Mrs. Patterson disappeared for 2-hour meetings every Tuesday afternoon, that the night security guard spent most of his time watching television in the lobby, and that several residents had family members who visited regularly and treated them like human beings rather than problems to be managed. Most importantly, I discovered that I wasn't the only person here who didn't belong. Eleanor Martinez had been a federal judge before retiring at 82. Her son had moved her to Sunrise Manor after she fell in her garden and broke her wrist, convincing her that living alone was no longer safe. That had been 8 months ago. Her wrist had healed perfectly, but somehow she was still here, her keen legal mind slowly atrophying from lack of stimulation. The trick, she told me one afternoon as we sat in what the facility optimistically called the library, a room with 3 shelves of large print romance novels and outdated magazines, is to make them think you're content while you figure out your options. Frank Washington had been a mechanical engineer for Boeing before his daughter decided that his mild forgetfulness meant he needed constant supervision. At 79, he could still rebuild a car engine from memory, but his family had convinced him that he was developing dementia because he occasionally forgot where he put his keys. "They want us to be grateful," Frank said during one of our increasingly frequent conversations. "Grateful that they've solved the problem of what to do with us. But gratitude for a cage is still imprisonment." Margaret Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, had run a successful catering business until a minor heart attack prompted her children to stage what she called an intervention, disguised as love. They had sold her business, liquidated her assets, and moved her to Sunrise Manor because they couldn't bear the thought of something happening to her while she was alone. "The irony," Margaret said with a bitter laugh, "is that I'm dying faster here than I ever would have at home. But at least they don't have to worry about getting a phone call in the middle of the night." These conversations became the highlight of my days. Here were people who understood what it felt like to have your autonomy stripped away by people who claimed to love you. We formed an unofficial support group, meeting in the garden during afternoon recreation time to share our stories, and increasingly to plan. It was Eleanor who first suggested that we might have legal recourse. "Power of attorney doesn't give someone unlimited control over your life," she explained during one of our sessions. "It's supposed to be used in your best interests, not theirs. If you can prove that the decisions being made aren't actually beneficial to you, you might be able to challenge them." Frank was more direct. "Forget the legal stuff," he said. "We're not prisoners. We can leave anytime we want. The question is whether we have anywhere to go." That was the heart of the problem, I realized. Rebecca hadn't just taken my house. She had eliminated my options. Without a home base, without my possessions, without access to my own money, I was effectively trapped not by locked doors, but by circumstances. It was Margaret who provided the solution, though it came in the form of a story rather than a plan. "My grandmother came to America from China with nothing but the clothes on her back," she told us one afternoon. "She didn't speak English, didn't know anyone, had no money and no skills that American employers valued. But she had something more important than any of those things. She had absolute determination to build a life on her own terms." Margaret paused, watching a group of residents shuffle past on their way to mandatory bingo. "She used to tell me that the secret wasn't having everything you needed to start over. The secret was being willing to start over with whatever you had, even if it was nothing." That night, I lay in my narrow bed thinking about Margaret's grandmother and about my own father, who had immigrated from Taiwan in 1962 with a chemistry degree that American universities didn't recognize and a determination to make a better life for his future family. He had worked as a janitor for 3 years while studying English and retaking his certification exams, never complaining, never giving up, always moving toward the life he wanted rather than accepting the limitations others tried to place on him. My father had started over at 28 with nothing but hope and stubbornness. I was starting over at 67 with something more valuable: experience, skills, and a clear understanding of what I didn't want my life to become. The next morning, I asked Carmen if I could use the computer in the activity room to email my daughter. What I actually did was research my options with a methodical approach that would have made my father proud. First, I looked up the laws regarding power of attorney in our state. Eleanor had been right. The authority Rebecca had been given was limited and specific, designed for emergency medical decisions, not wholesale life restructuring. The sale of my house, while technically legal under the broad interpretation of the documents I had signed, was questionable at best if I could prove that I was mentally competent and that the decision wasn't in my best interests. Second, I researched the investment account that David had supposedly set up with the proceeds from my house. Using information I remembered from our conversation, I was able to track down his real estate company and discovered that it specialized in distressed property acquisition, buying homes from elderly or desperate sellers at below market prices and flipping them for substantial profits. The sick feeling in my stomach intensified as I realized that my home hadn't just been sold. It had been sold to David's business partners at a price that was probably significantly below its actual market value. Rebecca and David had essentially stolen my house, sold it to themselves, and then convinced me that I should be grateful for their financial management. Third, I looked into assisted living facilities in other parts of the country, places where the cost of living was lower, and where I might be able to afford a small apartment on Social Security, and whatever remained of my retirement savings once I could access them. But it was the fourth thing I researched that changed everything. I had been thinking about my father's advice about starting over with whatever you had, when I remembered something Dr. Martinez had mentioned during one of my follow-up appointments. He had talked about a program that placed retired teachers in underserved communities, providing education support while offering housing and a small stipend. At the time, I had dismissed it as something for younger retirees, people who still had energy for adventure. Now, as I read about the Rural Education Initiative, I realized it might be exactly what I needed. The program actively recruited retired teachers to work in small communities that struggled to find qualified educators. They provided housing, utilities, a modest salary, and most importantly, a sense of purpose. The application process was rigorous, requiring medical clearance, background checks, and interviews. But as I read through the requirements, I felt a spark of excitement that I hadn't experienced since before my stroke. This wasn't just a way to escape Sunrise Manor. It was a way to reclaim my identity as an educator and contribute something meaningful to the world. Over the next several days, I quietly began gathering the documents I would need to apply. I contacted Dr. Martinez's office and requested copies of my medical records, emphasizing my recovery progress and my cognitive competency. I reached out to former colleagues who could provide professional references. I even contacted a lawyer Eleanor had recommended, someone who specialized in elder law and could help me understand my rights regarding the house sale and the power of attorney documents. The hardest part was doing all of this without arousing suspicion from the Sunrise Manor staff, or more importantly, from Rebecca, who had taken to calling every few days to check on my adjustment. "You sound much better, Dad," she said during one of these calls. "I can tell that being in a safe environment is helping your recovery." I had learned to modulate my voice during these conversations, to sound grateful but not too energetic, compliant but not completely passive. "The staff here is very nice," I told her, which was true enough. "I'm making some friends." "That's wonderful," Rebecca said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "I was worried that you might be resistant to change, but it sounds like you're really embracing this new chapter." New chapter. As if my life were a book that she was editing, removing the inconvenient parts and restructuring the narrative to better suit her vision of how things should be. "I've been thinking about the future," I said carefully. About what comes next. Oh, Dad, you don't need to worry about that. David and I have everything handled. We're looking into some excellent long-term care insurance policies, and we've already started planning for your future needs. My future needs. Determined by people who had known me for 6 months and 3 weeks respectively, planned around their convenience rather than my preferences. I'd like to be more involved in those decisions, I said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Dad, I think it's wonderful that you're feeling more engaged, but these are complicated financial and legal matters. You should focus on your recovery and let us handle the details. The condescension in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. I was being patted on the head and told to leave the important decisions to the adults. I understand, I said, which was true. I understood perfectly that Rebecca had no intention of returning any meaningful control over my life to me. After I hung up, I sat in my small room and felt something crystallize inside me. For weeks, I had been operating under the assumption that I needed to repair my relationship with Rebecca, that I needed to find a way to make her understand that I was still capable of managing my own life. But our conversation had made it clear that she had no interest in seeing me as anything other than a problem she had solved. Eleanor had been wrong about one thing. This wasn't really about legal recourse or challenging power of attorney documents. This was about something much more fundamental: the right to determine your own destiny, regardless of what other people thought was best for you. That evening, during our informal gathering in the garden, I told my friends about the Rural Education Initiative. "You're really going to do this?" Frank asked, his eyes bright with something that might have been envy or admiration. "I'm really going to try," I said. Margaret smiled. "My grandmother would have liked you," she said. "She always said that the most dangerous thing you could do was let other people convince you that you were too old, too weak, or too damaged to start over." Eleanor, ever the lawyer, was more practical. "What about your daughter? She's not going to just let you walk away from all this." I had been thinking about that too. "She made her choice when she sold my house without my consent," I said. "Now I'm making mine." The next morning, I submitted my application to the Rural Education Initiative. In the section asking why I wanted to participate in the program, I wrote about my father's courage in starting over in a new country, about my belief that education could transform lives, and about my desire to prove that recovery from a stroke didn't mean the end of a meaningful life. I didn't write about Rebecca or David or the house or any of the betrayals that had brought me to this point. This wasn't about revenge or spite. This was about redemption, not seeking forgiveness from others, but reclaiming my own sense of purpose and dignity. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call from a woman named Sarah Chen, another coincidental surname, who coordinated the Rural Education Initiative for the Pacific Northwest region. "Mr. Chen," she said, "we were very impressed with your application. Your experience teaching chemistry and your references are excellent. We have a position available in Cedar Falls, Montana, a small community that's been struggling to find a qualified science teacher for their high school. Would you be interested in a preliminary interview?" Cedar Falls, Montana. I had never been to Montana, had never even considered living anywhere outside the suburban community where I had spent my entire adult life. But as Sarah described the town, population 847, surrounded by national forest, a place where everyone knew everyone and where a good teacher could make a real difference, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. "Yes," I told Sarah. "I would be very interested in an interview." As I hung up the phone, I realized that for the first time since my stroke, I was thinking about the future in terms of possibilities rather than limitations. Rebecca had tried to write the final chapter of my story, but she had forgotten something important. I was the one holding the pen. The interview with Sarah Chen took place over video call in the facility's computer room, which I had reserved under the pretense of having a telehealth appointment. Mrs. Patterson had been delighted by my apparent engagement with my medical care, completely unaware that I was actually planning my escape from her sterile kingdom. Sarah appeared on screen as a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the weathered look of someone who had spent considerable time outdoors. Behind her, I could see mountains through a window, their peaks still capped with snow despite it being late spring. "Mr. Chen, thank you for taking the time to speak with me," she began. "I have to say your application stood out immediately. It's not often we receive inquiries from someone with your level of experience who's willing to relocate to such a remote area." "I'm looking for a change," I said simply. "Something meaningful." Over the next hour, Sarah painted a picture of Cedar Falls that was both challenging and inspiring. The town's previous science teacher had retired after 30 years, leaving behind outdated equipment and a curriculum that hadn't been updated since the 1990s. The students were bright but underserved, many of them from families who had lived in the area for generations, working in logging, ranching, or the few small businesses that kept the community alive. "We can offer you a small apartment above the town's general store," Sarah explained. "It's not luxurious, but it's comfortable and the rent is minimal. The salary is modest, about $30,000 a year, but the cost of living is low and the community tends to take care of its own." $30,000 a year. Before my stroke, I would have considered that poverty wages. Now, it sounded like freedom. "The position comes with some unique opportunities," Sarah continued. "The school district has received a grant to modernize their science program, which means you'd essentially be building a new curriculum from the ground up. You'd also have the chance to establish an environmental science program, taking advantage of our proximity to Glacier National Park." As she spoke, I felt my old passion for teaching beginning to reawaken. For 35 years, I had loved walking into a classroom and watching students discover that chemistry wasn't just about memorizing formulas, but about understanding the fundamental building blocks of everything around them. At Sunrise Manor, I was encouraged to participate in activities like craft time and sing-alongs. In Cedar Falls, I would be challenged to inspire a new generation of learners. "There is one concern I need to address," Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. "Your medical history indicates you've recently suffered a stroke. We want to ensure that you're physically and mentally capable of handling the demands of the position." I had prepared for this question. "Dr. Martinez, my neurologist, has cleared me for full activity," I said. "My speech has returned to normal. My motor functions are completely restored, and my cognitive abilities were never affected. I can provide updated medical documentation if needed." "We would appreciate that," Sarah said. "Assuming everything checks out medically, when would you be available to start?" "Immediately," I said, perhaps too quickly. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "The position doesn't begin until the fall semester. That's still 4 months away." "I understand," I said. "But I'm eager to get started. I could come to Cedar Falls early, help with curriculum development, get familiar with the community." "That's unusual," Sarah said slowly. "Most people want time to prepare for such a significant move. Are you sure you don't need to settle affairs where you are now?" I thought about my affairs. A 12 by 15 room containing one photograph and a change of clothes, a daughter who called weekly to ensure I was still properly contained, and a bank account I couldn't access because it was now managed by someone who saw me as an investment opportunity rather than a human being. "There's nothing keeping me here," I said with complete honesty. After the interview, I sat in the computer room for a long time, staring at the blank screen and feeling something I hadn't experienced since before Rebecca sold my house: agency. For the first time in months, I had made a decision about my future that was entirely my own. The next step was more complicated. I needed to leave Sunrise Manor without creating a legal or medical crisis that could be used to justify keeping me here involuntarily. I also needed to access at least some of my money, which meant confronting the reality of what Rebecca and David had done with the proceeds from my house. Eleanor proved invaluable in helping me navigate the legal complexities. During our evening conversations in the garden, she walked me through the process of challenging a power of attorney agreement and reclaiming control of my finances. The key is documenting your competency, she explained. You need current medical evaluations, cognitive assessments, and preferably a witness to your mental state who has legal credibility. Like a retired federal judge? I asked. Eleanor smiled. Exactly like a retired federal judge. I'll be happy to provide an affidavit stating that you are clearly competent to make your own decisions. Frank, meanwhile, helped me with the practical aspects of leaving. As an engineer, he approached the problem systematically, identifying potential obstacles and developing solutions. Transportation is your biggest challenge, he said. You can't just walk out of here and hitchhike to Montana. You need a plan that gets you from point A to point B without involving anyone who might try to stop you. Margaret, with her business background, helped me understand my financial options. Even if you can't access the investment account immediately, you should have other resources, she pointed out. Social Security, pension payments, maybe some savings accounts that weren't affected by the power of attorney. Over the following weeks, I began assembling the pieces of my escape plan. I contacted Dr. Martinez and scheduled a comprehensive evaluation to document my recovery. I reached out to the lawyer Eleanor had recommended and began the process of challenging the power of attorney arrangement. Most importantly, I started rebuilding my identity as someone other than a victim of circumstances. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. During one of Rebecca's weekly check-in calls, she mentioned that she and David were planning a 3-week vacation to Europe. It's our 1-year anniversary, she explained, and David has some business meetings in London. We'll be gone most of July. July. That was when I needed to be in Cedar Falls to begin preparing for the fall semester. That sounds wonderful, I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. You both deserve a break. I'm glad you understand, Dad. I was worried. You might feel abandoned or something. Abandoned. The irony was so perfect it was almost funny. Rebecca was worried about abandoning me for 3 weeks, apparently unaware that she had already abandoned me the moment she decided I was too inconvenient to fit into her new life. I'll be fine, I assured her. I'm getting very comfortable here. After I hung up, I realized that Rebecca's vacation represented the perfect opportunity. With her out of the country, she would be less likely to notice immediately if I disappeared from Sunrise Manor. By the time she returned, I would be established in Cedar Falls, surrounded by people who valued my contributions rather than viewing me as a burden to be managed. The final piece of the puzzle came from Sarah Chen, who called 2 weeks later with news that changed everything. Mr. Chen, I have an unusual proposition, she said. We've had an unexpected development here in Cedar Falls. Our current interim science teacher has had a family emergency and needs to leave immediately. Would you be willing to start this summer instead of waiting until fall? Absolutely, I said without hesitation. There's one more thing, Sarah continued. The school board has approved funding for you to attend a 2-week environmental education workshop at Yellowstone National Park. It would give you the background you need to develop our new environmental science curriculum. The workshop starts next Monday. Yellowstone, in 1 week. It was as if the universe was conspiring to help me reclaim my life. I'll be there, I said. That evening, I shared the news with Eleanor, Frank, and Margaret during our garden meeting. Their excitement was palpable, but it was mixed with something else. Envy, perhaps, or a kind of vicarious hope. You're really doing it, Frank said, shaking his head in amazement. You're actually getting out of here. We all could, I said. There's nothing stopping any of us except our own belief that we don't have options. Eleanor smiled sadly. It's easier when you're starting from scratch, she said. I still have a house, investments, family members who would fight any attempt to leave. My cage may be more comfortable than yours was, but it's still a cage. Then maybe it's time to pick the lock, I suggested. Over the next few days, I quietly began preparing for my departure. I contacted a taxi company and arranged for pickup at 6 a.m. on Monday morning, timing it for a shift change when the facility would be least staffed. I packed my few belongings into a single small suitcase, including the photograph of Rebecca that had sat on my dresser for months. I also wrote 3 letters. The first was to Mrs. Patterson, explaining that I was leaving voluntarily and providing contact information for my lawyer in case there were any questions about my legal right to do so. The second was to Dr. Martinez, thanking him for his care and requesting that my medical records be forwarded to the clinic in Cedar Falls. The third letter was the hardest to write. It was addressed to Rebecca, and I must have started it a dozen times before finding the right words. Dear Rebecca, I finally wrote, by the time you read this, I will be starting a new chapter of my life in Cedar Falls, Montana, where I've accepted a position teaching high school chemistry. I want you to know that I don't blame you for the decisions you made while I was recovering from my stroke. I believe you genuinely thought you were acting in my best interests. However, I've realized that what you thought was best for me and what I need to be happy and fulfilled are very different things. I am not angry, and I am not trying to punish you. I am simply reclaiming my right to determine my own future. I hope that someday you will understand that being your father doesn't mean I have to accept your vision of what my life should look like. I love you, and I will always be proud of the strong, independent woman you've become. I hope you can extend me the same courtesy and respect my decision to be a strong, independent man. You can reach me through the school district if you need to contact me. Please don't try to bring me back to Sunrise Manor. I am exactly where I need to be. Sunday night, I barely slept. I lay in the narrow bed, listening to the familiar sounds of institutional life around me, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant beeping of medical equipment, the restless movements of people who had forgotten what it felt like to be truly at home anywhere. At 5:30 a.m., I got dressed quietly and made my way to the lobby, carrying my single suitcase and the letters I had written. The night security guard was dozing in his chair, exactly as I had expected. I left the letters at the front desk and walked outside to wait for my taxi. The morning air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of flowers from the facility's landscaped gardens. As I stood there waiting, I thought about my father arriving in America 55 years earlier, carrying everything he owned in a single suitcase and armed with nothing but determination and hope. The taxi arrived precisely at 6 a.m. As we pulled away from Sunrise Manor, I didn't look back. I had spent too much of my life looking backward, trying to hold on to things that were already gone. Today, I was looking forward. The drive to the airport took 45 minutes. During that time, I called Sarah Chen to confirm my travel arrangements and let her know I was on my way. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and by the time I reached the airport, I felt like a man heading toward adventure rather than away from disappointment. As I checked in for my flight to Montana, the ticket agent smiled and asked if I was traveling for business or pleasure. Education, I said, and realized that it was both. The flight to Missoula was my first time on an airplane in over a decade. As we climbed above the clouds and the landscape spread out below us, I felt a sense of possibility that I hadn't experienced since I was young. Somewhere below us was Cedar Falls, Montana, where people I had never met were counting on me to help prepare their children for the future. More importantly, somewhere below us was the next chapter of my own story, waiting to be written by the only person qualified to write it. Me. The 2 weeks at Yellowstone changed everything I thought I knew about myself. The environmental education workshop brought together educators from across the country, and I quickly discovered that being 67 made me not the oldest participant. but rather someone with a unique perspective that younger teachers valued. Dr. Patricia Williams, a marine biologist from Oregon who was leading one of the sessions, put it perfectly. Experience isn't a liability in education, it's a superpower. The workshop challenged us to think beyond traditional classroom boundaries. We spent mornings in seminars learning about ecosystem dynamics and climate science, then spent afternoons hiking through the park, collecting water samples, observing wildlife behavior, and developing hands-on curriculum that would bring abstract scientific concepts to life for students. On our third day, while standing at the edge of the Grand Prismatic Spring watching steam rise from water heated by the Earth's core, I had a moment of perfect clarity. For months, I had been defined by what I had lost: my house, my independence, my relationship with my daughter. But here, surrounded by the raw power and beauty of nature, I realized that I hadn't lost anything that truly mattered. I had gained something far more valuable: the freedom to discover who I could become when I wasn't limited by other people's expectations. My workshop partner was Maria Santos, a 34-year-old biology teacher from New Mexico, who was transitioning from urban to rural education. During our evening planning sessions, she shared her own story of transformation. "I was teaching in Albuquerque for 8 years," she explained as we worked on developing a water quality testing curriculum. "Good salary, excellent benefits, clear career path. But I was miserable. The classes were too large, the bureaucracy was suffocating, and I felt like I was processing students through an assembly line rather than actually teaching them." "What changed your mind?" I asked. "My grandmother," Maria said with a smile. "She was a teacher in rural Mexico for 40 years. Never made much money, never had fancy resources, but she transformed her entire community through education. When she died last year, I realized I wanted to honor her legacy by making the same kind of impact." Listening to Maria, I understood that my journey to Cedar Falls wasn't just about escaping an unwanted situation. It was about returning to the core purpose that had drawn me to teaching in the first place. Before Rebecca's betrayal, before the stroke, before years of suburban routine had dulled my sense of adventure, I had chosen education because I believed it could change lives. The workshop culminated in a presentation where each team demonstrated a hands-on science activity they had developed. Maria and I created a simulation showing how thermal features like those in Yellowstone could be replicated in a classroom setting, using simple materials to demonstrate concepts of heat transfer, chemical reactions, and geological processes. The beauty of this approach, I explained to the group, is that students don't just memorize facts about geothermal energy, they experience the principles firsthand. They become scientists, not just students of science. Dr. Williams approached me after the presentation. "Robert, that was exceptional work," she said. "Have you considered publishing your curriculum development? There's a real need for innovative approaches to rural science education." Publishing. I hadn't written anything for academic journals since my early teaching years, when such activities had been encouraged for professional development. The idea of returning to educational research excited me in a way I hadn't expected. "I'd be very interested in exploring that," I said. "Excellent. I'm editing a special issue on environmental education in underserved communities. I think your perspective could be valuable, especially your experience with adapting to different educational environments later in your career." That evening, I called Sarah Chen from my hotel room in the park. "Robert," she said, clearly pleased to hear from me. "How's the workshop going?" "Better than I could have imagined," I said. "I'm learning as much as I'm contributing, which hasn't happened to me in years." "That's wonderful. Are you still planning to arrive in Cedar Falls next week?" "Absolutely. But I have a question. Would the school district be interested in pursuing grant funding for an advanced environmental science program? I'm developing some ideas that could put Cedar Falls on the map academically." There was excitement in Sarah's voice when she responded. Robert, that's exactly the kind of initiative we've been hoping for. The school board has been looking for ways to distinguish our programs and keep our brightest students engaged. Can you tell me more? Over the next 20 minutes, I outlined my vision for turning Cedar Falls High School into a model for rural environmental education. Using Yellowstone and Glacier National Park as living laboratories, we could develop partnerships with universities, attract visiting researchers, and create opportunities for students that most urban schools couldn't match. This is incredible, Sarah said. I'm setting up a meeting with the school board for your first week here. They're going to love this. After I hung up, I sat by the window of my hotel room, looking out at the Yellowstone landscape under a canopy of stars more brilliant than any I had seen in decades of suburban living. For the first time since my stroke, I felt genuinely excited about the future. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. My heart sank as I realized it was probably from Rebecca, who had somehow tracked down my new contact information. Instead, the message read, "Mr. Chen, this is Margaret from Sunrise Manor. Eleanor wanted me to tell you that she's filed papers to challenge her son's guardianship. Frank has contacted his daughter about moving back to his own apartment. You inspired all of us. Thank you for showing us that it's never too late to fight for ourselves. M." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Part of me was thrilled that my friends had found their own courage to reclaim their lives. Another part felt guilty that I had essentially abandoned them to pursue my own freedom. But as I thought about it more, I realized that the most valuable gift I could have given them wasn't my continued presence at Sunrise Manor, but rather proof that escape was possible. Sometimes the most powerful form of help is demonstrating that change is achievable, even when circumstances seem hopeless. The flight from Yellowstone to Missoula was my first step towards Cedar Falls, but the drive from Missoula to my new home was when everything became real. Sarah had arranged for Tom Bradley, the high school principal, to pick me up at the airport. Tom turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had grown up in Cedar Falls, left for college, and a brief career in Seattle, then returned to raise his own family in the community that had shaped him. "Fair warning," Tom said as we drove through the Montana countryside. "Cedar Falls isn't like anywhere you've probably lived before. We've got one grocery store, one gas station, one restaurant that's only open Thursday through Sunday, and a population that considers anyone who's lived here less than 20 years to be new." "Oh, sounds perfect," I said, and meant it. "The other thing you should know," Tom continued, "is that people here will test you. Not maliciously, but they need to know you're committed before they invest in you. We've had teachers come and go when they realized that rural life wasn't as romantic as they'd imagined. As we crested a hill and Cedar Falls came into view, I understood what Tom meant. The town consisted of perhaps 50 buildings scattered along a valley floor, surrounded by mountains that seemed to touch the sky. It was beautiful in a way. That took my breath away, but it was also clearly isolated, probably 30 miles from the nearest substantial town. "The school serves kids from a pretty wide area," Tom explained as we drove down what appeared to be the main street. "Some of them bus in from ranches that are 20 miles away. We've got about 80 students total, grades K through 12. 80 students. At my previous school, I had taught that many students in a single day. The intimacy of it was both exciting and intimidating. My apartment was exactly what Sarah had described. A modest space above Carter's general store, with a small living room, bedroom, kitchenette, and bathroom. The windows faced west toward the mountains, and the late afternoon light streaming. Through them painted everything in golden hues. "Mrs. Carter left some groceries for you," Tom said, pointing to bags on the small kitchen counter. "She's excited to have a teacher living upstairs. Her grandson will be in your chemistry class this fall." After Tom left, I stood in my new home and tried to process the magnitude of what I had done. A week ago, I had been a resident of an assisted living facility. My daily schedule determined by someone else's routine. My future planned by people who saw me as a problem to be managed. Now I was standing in my own apartment, preparing to begin a job that would challenge me intellectually and professionally, in a place where the nearest neighbor probably knew more about my qualifications than about my medical history. My phone rang, startling me out of my reflection. The caller ID showed Rebecca's number. I had been expecting this call ever since leaving Sunrise Manor, but I still felt my heart rate increase as I answered. Dad. Rebecca's voice was tight with anger and something that might have been fear. What the hell do you think you're doing? Hello, Rebecca, I said calmly. I'm settling into my new home in Montana. Your new home? Dad, you're sick. You just had a stroke. You can't be living alone in the middle of nowhere. I'm not sick, I said. I'm recovered. And I'm not alone. I'm part of a community that values what I have to contribute. This is insane, Rebecca said, her voice rising. You can't just disappear without telling anyone. I've been trying to reach you for 3 days. Do you have any idea how worried I've been? Worried. I thought about the 3 months I had spent at Sunrise Manor, calling her weekly to report on my adjustment, never receiving a visit, never being asked about my preferences for my own future. I left you a letter explaining everything, I said. A letter, Rebecca repeated. You think a letter justifies abandoning your family and running away to some random place where nobody knows you? Rebecca, I said, keeping my voice steady, I didn't abandon my family. I reclaimed my life. Dad, you're not thinking clearly. The stroke affected my speech and motor functions temporarily, I interrupted. It didn't affect my ability to make decisions about my own life. I've been medically cleared for full activity, and I'm currently employed as a high school chemistry teacher. There was silence on the other end of the line. When Rebecca spoke again, her tone had shifted from anger to something more calculating. Dad, I understand that you're feeling restless, but this fantasy about teaching again isn't realistic. You're 67 years old. You've been out of the classroom for years. And you're living in the middle of nowhere without proper medical support. Fantasy. The word stung, but it also crystallized something for me. Rebecca genuinely believed that my desire for independence and purpose was a delusion brought on by illness and age. It's not a fantasy, I said. I'm here, I'm working, and I'm happier than I've been in years. Happiness isn't the point, Rebecca said, exasperation creeping into her voice. Safety is the point. Practicality is the point. What happens when you have another stroke? What happens when you fall and break a hip? What happens when you realize you can't handle the isolation and the physical demands? Her questions revealed everything I needed to know about how she saw me. In Rebecca's mind, I was a collection of potential medical emergencies waiting to happen, a liability that needed to be managed rather than a person with agency and capabilities. If any of those things happen, I said, I'll deal with them like any other adult deals with life's challenges, but I'm not going to live in anticipation of worst-case scenarios. Dad, please, Rebecca said, and now there was genuine pleading in her voice. Just come home. We can talk about this. Maybe we can find a compromise. Home. She was asking me to return to a place that was no longer mine, to resume a life that had been designed around her convenience rather than my fulfillment. I am home, I said gently. This is where I belong right now. That's ridiculous, Rebecca snapped, her patience apparently exhausted. You belong with your family. You belong where people can take care of you. I don't need to be taken care of, I said. I need to be valued for what I can contribute, not managed because of what I might need. This conversation is pointless, Rebecca said. You're clearly not capable of making rational decisions right now. I'm going to contact my lawyer about having you declared incompetent. The threat hung in the air between us like a weapon. Rebecca was prepared to legally strip away my autonomy if I refused to accept her version of what my life should look like. That's your choice, I said, surprised by how calm I felt. But you should know that I have legal representation as well, and my competency has been thoroughly documented by multiple medical professionals. Dad! Rebecca, I said, cutting her off. I love you. I will always love you. But I will not live my life according to your fears about what might happen to me. I hope someday you can understand that choosing my own path isn't a rejection of you. It's an affirmation of who I am. I hung up before she could respond, then turned off my phone. Outside my window, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that no photograph could capture. Tomorrow, I would begin preparing curriculum for students who would challenge me to be the best teacher I had ever been. Tonight, I would sit in my own chair, in my own home, and plan my own future. For the first time in months, the future felt full of possibility rather than limitation. Rebecca could threaten legal action, could question my competency, could try to convince the world that I was a confused old man making irrational decisions. But she couldn't change the fundamental truth that I had discovered over the past few weeks. I was still Robert Chen, still a teacher, still a man capable of growth and contribution and joy. The phone stayed off for the rest of the evening. Whatever crisis Rebecca was manufacturing could wait until tomorrow. Tonight belonged to me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.